Good afternoon. My name is Bonnie Kennedy, actually Bonnie Richardson Kennedy. I was born in 1949, and my parents were Barbara Frankish and Bill Richardson. And I've lived in Lindsay all my life, apart from going away to school and jobs and whatnot. So it's my pleasure to give you some information about my dad, Bill Richardson, and he was born in Campbellford and became a lawyer at U of T in the 30s. He was a known bugle player for the, I'm trying to think of, I guess it was the Varsity Blues.
Yeah.
And he'd play some songs that were indicative of whether the team was winning or losing. So it was quite interesting. And my parents moved to Lindsay around 1948, I believe. I was born in Lindsay in 1949 at the Ross Memorial Hospital, so I know we were there here in 49. My dad also was involved with World War II. In fact, I think he stepped out of university for a while to become a flight instructor around the Mountain View, Trenton area. And then he went back to school and completed his law degree. At which time he was asked by Leslie Frost to come and join the firm. So he became a member of Queen's Counsel in 1959. One of the, I guess, significant things in the town of Lindsay was that Uncle Les and my dad, the firm then was Frost and Richardson, because Cecil Frost was part of the mix at that point in I think name only. But anyway. So they had an office on the second floor of the Blackwell building, and when it burned down, I'm going to say that was in 1960, the law firm moved kitty corner to the Blackwell building. So that would be on the southwest side of Kent Street, at the corner of Kent and Cambridge. And in 1963, Dad was appointed a judge, and he died in 1976, at a very young age. Obviously, I think he hadn't yet turned 60, so he had a very short life. And my mom, they were married in Toronto during the war. My mom's family name was Frankish, and her father was a doctor and the first coroner of Ontario, if the story is accurate. Certainly a pioneer in forensics and that sort of thing. My mom and dad were very interested in the community. In those days, women didn't work as much outside the home as they do today, so my mom was involved with volunteering, and they were involved with things like the Progress Club and Cambridge Street United Church, and my mom was CGIT leader for a while. So Mom was very involved with the volunteer sector in those days.
My name is Dale Kennedy. I was born 06/06/43. Grew up all my life, with the exception of education, away from town in Lindsay. Primarily lived at 56 Regent Street. So our family came from County Cork, Ireland in 1832. We were 1 year in Quebec at Trois-Rivières. The next year we came up to Pigeon Lake, and we came up by a corduroy road from Port Hope. We stayed there over the winter on Pigeon Lake. They made mud huts, and then they moved off to allocation of land on the Scotch line in Dunsford. It was 100 acres there from the Crown, and they started to clear the land, and that was John Kennedy and Rebecca Forsyth. They brought with them one boy whose name was William. He later was in business himself, William. So John lived until 1865, the American Revolution. He wasn't in it, but that was the age. And then William Kennedy, his son, was next in line. He was famous for construction of pole barns in central Ontario, literally hundreds of them. and he had very large crews. Up to 60 men would move throughout central Ontario building these barns as they were clearing the land. It was a requirement to get the deed for the land, that they had to be cleared in a certain period of time, stumps had to be removed, etc. It's a very busy time at that time. So that was William Kennedy, and then his son was Willie B. Kennedy, and he lived on the Scotch line in Dunsford. And that's where the affiliation out in that area came about. He married Rebecca Thurston. So the Thurstons and the Kennedys came together at that particular time. Willie B. died in 1930. Willie B. and Rebecca were famous on Ken Hill Beach, which a lot of people know about. That was Kennedy's Hill, and that was the farm that Willie B. lived on. And Ken Hill Beach was developed by his wife, not by William, but by his wife Rebecca Thurston. She built 30 homes along their cottages, and they often rented them. So Willie B. and Rebecca's wife was, their son was named John Norman Kennedy. He became the reeve of Victoria County. And he was in business in Lindsay on some of the original cockshot tractors and farm implements on William Street South, right in the village. You would have hay binders, etc. That's where my father started his business, Earl Kennedy Electric. It was handy because they lived at 28 Cambridge Street South, and he would be able to go back and forth to work. My grandfather gave him a small bench at the back to try and repair radios, this newfangled thing, a radio. And he started to build the business, and it was spectacular. He then moved across the street to 24 William Street, which was a small church. And that's where we are even today, with more additions on the building, etc. But nonetheless, that's where we are. So Earl Kennedy was my father. He started the business in 1932. Today it's 87 years in business. I'm his son, his second son. My brother Gary was older, and myself, and then my sister Ruth, who's 7 years younger than I am. That was the family then of Earl and Muriel Kennedy. She was a McGill from Bunkers Hill, actually, is the actual address. She was a driving force of our firm. She was responsible for getting franchises from General Motors, etc. She was a huge driving force. My father was very skilled and what have you, but she was amazing. And so I joined the business in about 1962. I've been there for 56 years. Interestingly enough, my father worked hard since he was 16. He retired at the age of 53, completely. And he had other interests in real estate and what have you. But he did not work in there after he was 53 years old. Today, the business is owned and by my son, Zach Kennedy. He's been there at this time 6.5 years, and is doing a fabulous job. Very well liked by the people, and it's very pleasing to see that. When I was about 6-7 years old, I lived through some miraculous things. We were the first people to have a television set in Central Ontario. My father was right involved with electronics, and we got a television set in 1951. My father bought it and had it shipped up from New York City. We presently have that in our little museum. My brother and I have a museum of firsts. That television set is in our possession. We found it and we went out and bought it. It looks like an oscilloscope. Because my father was quite brilliant on transmission and what have you, we had a homemade aerial that allowed us to watch periodically, a little snowy, television from Rochester, New York. There was no transmission of any television whatsoever of any kind in this country. And so my father bought the television set from Radio Corporation of America in Manhattan. It was shipped up in 2 large crates. It arrived in kit form. It would not work, of course. You had to put it together. It took about 2 months to get it together, and he finally got it up and running. So my brother and I used to watch The Lone Ranger when we were 70 years ago. Watch The Lone Ranger from either Syracuse or Rochester. Depending upon the weather, it was really good. When it was super, we'd get Syracuse, which was howdy doody. It was incredible. Couldn't believe it. I was a young entrepreneur, and I was figuring we could make money on this, bring the local boys and girls in, and they would see television, never heard of it. We'd be able to watch that, and we could make some money. When we were 7 and he was 10, we went into business manufacturing plaster of Paris brooches and everything. And I would peddle them from door to door in the North Ward. It was it was fantastic. We did a really good job. And until we went, I remember there was a Miss Ford that lived on Elgin Street. She asked me, please don't come back again, dear. We've bought 3 brooches. No more. Then we moved off that and went to Alexander School. And we got the idea that from television, there was a guy selling papers on the television. So my brother and I said, we could do it. So we went down after school at Alexander. We would go down to the post and go in the back printing room, and we would purchase papers there for 2 cents each day, and it would be 12 to 20 papers. We would take them up to Kent Street. The post was on William Street North. Take it up to William and Kent and peddle them in all 4 corners for 5 cents. It would bring in probably $1 or something per day in 20 minutes. So I said, this is really good. This is a great thing. I liked the post. I was a post carrier actually until I was 13. I enjoyed it. It was handy for me. I used to curl a lot in grade 9 in high school. And it made sense to me, entrepreneurially, to go over and buy some papers, get my papers, and do them on my route back home to 56 Regent. I'm going to walk there anyway. I may as well make money while I'm going home. That was the deal. My father was very successful in real estate, and just after the war, he was able to buy a piece of land that he loved on Cedar Glen, which was near Emily Creek. He bought that land at that time, and he paid a fortune for it, $10,000. It was 50 acres of land on Sturgeon Lake with 3,000 feet of shoreline. And we grew up there. We had an unbelievable youth in that area. It was just incredible. Freedom. My love of the newspaper brought me to the Telegram distribution up and down the beach. There's about 25 cottages in Cedar Glen. So I had to take the paper and go up to Greenhurst and get the paper, and then come back with the paper and distribute it on the way back. It came to me, and I was about, again, 8 or 9. I asked my mother if she would take me over to the Scotch Line. There's a guy over there that had a big garden, and I would buy carrots and squash, all kinds of stuff from him, take it back, and I'd wash it in the lake. And I had a wagon, so on the way up to get my papers from Thurstonia, I peddled vegetables all the way up, then park my wagon, and then bring the papers all the way back. So I made money going up to work and money coming back down the beach at the same time. Super idea. Worked like a charm.
So, as I said earlier, I went to, or Dale went to Alexander School, as did I, and we both went to Central Senior School, and we both went to LCVI. There was only one high school, I believe, in the community at that time, i.e. Wilda, had not been built yet. We also both really loved to curl when we were in high school. We both won a couple of divisions. We were at different times because Dale was out of high school on his way to Radio College of Canada, and I was, I think, still in grade 9 at that point. So Dale's experience at the curling club was finished by the time I got there, but we both really enjoyed it as we enjoyed the competitive nature of it. And also, I think Dale was very involved with some of the sports that took place indoors at the armories years ago. And I played. I always did exercise classes at the armories, but I think you did
Badminton extensively.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
For a number of years.
Oh yes. Yeah.
And also in terms of the main street of Lindsay and what was there back in the day, obviously the main street looks radically different than what it did back in those days. I'm not sure if I can even remember the main stores, although when I was mentioning the Blackwell building years ago, at the bottom of that building was it Crothers? There was a drugstore.
Yeah, pharmacy.
And lunch bar.
Mm-hmm.
It was quite an interesting combination. Pharmacy at the front, lunch bar at the back, and another, I guess, really good memory I have of one of the old restaurants was the Olympia. It was a mainstay as well.
Yep.
And Lynn's Lunch,
Yes.
as I recall.
Yes.
That was on William Street North.
Yeah, east side.
Yeah. And then of course we always had the theater for a long time. The Academy Theater at the end of the street, and the Century Theater, which was
Cinema.
pretty fancy. Yes, in the main area. Those are some of my recollections. I mean, how would
There
you-
was another theater there, right beside the Academy. If you go south about 50 feet, that was called the Kent Theater Cinema. And I remember in there, very, very young, maybe 6 or 7, everybody would start to yell because it faced due west. And when you opened the door into the theater, you could see daylight. It would just come through very bright. That was not to stand much longer. When the Century opened, it was just fabulous. I couldn't believe that Century. Amazing thing.
Also, your parents were very involved with St. Paul's Church for a long time, and
Yes.
Dale tells a really good story of ringing the bell at St. Paul's and riding the
Yeah.
cord, not the cord. What's it called?
It's a pulling cord. Yeah.
Yes, up because he was so small, and then it went down, and he'd go down. And
I used to get trouble for that. Reverend Canon Hesketh wasn't impressed because what we would do, Bill White and my friend up on Albert Street North, if you pull a bell of that size and you pull down on it, there's an upward thrust on the other side. So you pull it down and hold onto the cord and you'd go 10, 15 feet in the air. The difficulty is that Reverend Hesketh was very annoyed, and he knew we were into it because it would go ding, and then it was a make, and then dong, ding, ding dong. And he knew we were in there doing that. Also in St. Paul's, I know she mentioned the grapevine. I was reading your article in there. Jimmy Mackey was one of my cub leaders in there. We were Wolf Pack 6. That was the Anglican Church, and it was operated by Jimmy, and Ron Richardson, and Olive was also the helper.
yeah, Ron Richards.
Ron Richards, yeah.
Yeah.
Olive was Bagheera. That's the female helper of Aquila. Aquila is the main man. So that was just an amazing thing. Also, another note in history there, relative to Muriel Kennedy and my, I really enjoyed softball. It's really good. Victoria Park in the summer, couldn't be beat. I remember so clearly my mother, she was in the kitchen and said, what do you think of the fact that I'm going to start a band in Lindsay, the Lindsay Band? I said, oh, that's a good thing. She said, you must play an instrument. And I said, oh no, like I'm playing softball in Victoria Park. And her response to that was, you'll look very good and enjoy the clarinet. And that was that. So she and McMullen,
Lloyd McMullen.
Lloyd McMullen, the next door neighbor, said, we're going to start a band. and it's lunacy. She did. She put it all together. The two of them got it going. Went to town council. So we need some help here. We're buying these instruments, and it's important that we have to have them. It was being set up by a company in London, and the town council said, "No, we won't be able to do that. Sorry, can't help you." My father wrote a check for $5,000 for all the instruments, and that was the Lindsay Boys and Girls Band. So successful later that the Kinsmen said, "We want to sponsor this." The Lindsay Kinsmen Boys and Girls Band. That was a little history there. That's where that came from. My mother's kitchen.
One of the things that had a real impact on me as somebody going to school in the 60s was the women's movement. 1975 was International Women's Year, but during the 60s there was a lot of, evolution of who the education system is in place to serve. And I was lucky enough to have access to and exposure to different views on the public education system and how we can make it more open and how we can make it more accessible to those who may not be typically identified with post-secondary education. The other thing related to the women's movement was the role of women on boards and commissions, and this was moving more into the 70s. And I do really remember one of our women leaders in the community, Margot Fawcett, who was very instrumental in my way of thinking to women viewing themselves as having a place on boards and commissions, aside from the obvious that women represent 50% of the population, giving women a voice in policy discussions and on boards and commissions. And I was very fortunate to have access to Margot and her support, and because of her guidance, I became involved with the Ross Memorial Hospital in the 1980s as a member of their board, and later ran for a school board. I did discover, thanks to her influence, that I did have an interest in public policy. Yet another trend really connected to that first one was the importance of having role models and mentors, especially for people who do see themselves, as many women do, marginalized in occupations, certain occupations, or on boards and commissions. It's really important to see yourself in the labor force and in those roles. And we certainly see that in terms of people who want to run for political office as well. It used to be very unusual for a woman politician in terms of party politics to run for office, and now we see that that's changed. So that's very much an evolution as well. I guess one of the greatest evolutions I see is in the field of education. My particular field is looking at education through a non-traditional lens. So who are the people who are traditionally involved with or connected with education, and how do they traditionally get their education and when? And then looking at the long term, because we are all lifelong learners. So looking at non-traditional learning, issues around access, transferability of credits, transferability of the experience we get in the paid sector as well as the unpaid volunteer sector, and how those learning experiences all contribute to who we are and all contribute to the knowledge, skills, and abilities that we acquire throughout our life. So recognizing those really fundamental components of lifelong learning has really been the driving force of my career. I also think that the whole college system actually developed in the 1960s. So that was a huge evolution, so that people who wanted to go to college or university or back and forth had those options. So I think that was a very important evolutionary factor that we need to be grateful for, because it did give people who might not have decided to go to university an option. And of course the trades, access to the trades for women as well, that was a really amazing trend and an evolution. Career advising for those who perhaps don't really know what they want to do when they grow up, when adults perhaps become unemployed. We have an example right now with General Motors and the manufacturing sector generally. So career advising, where we can help an individual recognize that their knowledge, skills, and abilities does not just come from formal classroom learning. It comes from all learning. I think the nature of work as well has been hugely affected by mobility and by technology. And what I mean by that is that people who work in the community was the model years ago. Today, you might live in our community but work outside the community. So just the nature of employment is a really important trend, and one that's affected my life tremendously, because even though I started working at the college years ago in Peterborough and in Lindsay, I became the executive director of a virtual Canadian association. Since 2002, I've worked predominantly remotely from my home. So it's a very important trend, I think, in the evolution of communities and labor force development and employment. In terms of social change and how daycare helped women with their forays into the labor force, one of the things that happened in our community in the 70s was work by a number of families, ours included, to bring a Montessori school to Lindsay. So after 2 years of work, we opened the doors of the Montessori Children's House in 1979 at St. Paul's Anglican Church in Lindsay.